Good morning and welcome to Rose Red Homestead, where, as you all know, we focus on self-reliance, food security, and emergency preparedness. Hundreds and hundreds of videos we have done on these topics for benefit of anyone who is interested in those topics. And we appreciate our audience so very much and for the sharing that you do with others. This is important information that needs to get out to many people in these trying times that we are living in. We're outside, obviously, the sun is hitting me straight in the face, and I'm standing by my all-time favorite apple tree. And we had probably our best apple year this year. We did spray for worms earlier this year, but most of them still have wormholes in them. But aside from that, we've had a couple of storms in the last few days that have carried big winds and lots of rain. And look at the apples that are on the ground. Hundreds of apples on the ground. So what do we do with these apples? In previous years, I have made applesauce, and we have so much applesauce that we probably have a 10-year supply of applesauce, and it may or may not last that long. We could freeze dry the applesauce. We could turn it into fruit leather in a dehydrator. We could also with the ones that are still pretty good and on the trees when they get ripe, and we're in the season where most of them are getting ripe right now, we could do some dehydrated apples, which are just fantastic. But today we're going to do something that I had a false start on probably 2 years before we started this video channel. So that would make it about 6.5 or 7 years ago. I attempted to make vinegar, and I jump in with both feet a lot of times and read some things and thought, oh, this is easy, I can do it. But I started way too broadly. I decided I was going to make about 6 different flavors of vinegar. And so I started everything all at once, and things decayed and rotted and started smelling like a boozy place. And I finally just dumped the whole thing and haven't touched it since. I was very, very busy back then with my job and didn't really have the time to spend with it. But I've done a lot more research and reading on it and looking at other YouTube videos. And we'll talk more about that when we get back in the kitchen. For now, I have my little basket, and I am going to gather some apples that have fallen on the ground, and we're going to turn those into vinegar. And that's why we're calling this fallen apple vinegar. So I'm going to gather apples, and then we will see you back in the kitchen in just a few minutes. I've put them out here on this table, and they were dirtier than I realized. So I'm just going to hose them off before we take them in the house. Every one that I can see has worms, but that is okay. We're going to sidestep the worms. All right, I'll see you in the kitchen. Before we actually get started with the vinegar, I want to get caught up on my weigh-in for you. This is what my weigh-in now looks like. This is week number 14 for me, and I am down a total of 10 pounds. This little descent, which I'm very excited about, is actually, I can blame it on our refrigerator troubles, because I was not eating the way I should have been eating when we were without a refrigerator. And that is, you may remember in a previous video, I talked about that was the turning point for me when I made the decision to go ahead and start working on recipes for nutrient-dense meals. And I'm turning that into a book. I'm about halfway finished with it. It is going to include meal recipes for breakfast, lunch, dinner, and then some snacks. And what I have found is that whenever I do a recipe book, we always test every recipe. So I've been making these meals, and that's what we have been eating for the past 3 or 4 weeks as I have been working on this book. And it is really paying off when I stay on nutrient-dense meals, which is low calories and high nutrition, including attempting to hit my target of 30 grams of protein per meal, 90 per day. So this is really working for me. I'm very excited about it, and I will be very pleased to bring you that book. It's about half done, and it's a little bit slow going with other major projects that we have running in the background right now. So I'm going to set this aside, and let's talk vinegar. So what is vinegar anyway? Well, this is some raw, unfiltered apple cider vinegar. I bought this at Costco, and it has a lot of sediment at the bottom and the mother. Now, vinegar produces, unfiltered and raw vinegar produces a gelatinous mixture. Once it is fully developed, it like floats, and it is a gelatinous mixture of the yeast and the bacteria, the healthy bacteria that make the vinegar. And so when you make vinegar, you can start with using a little bit of organic, raw, unfiltered vinegar that has a lot of the mother in it. Now, the vinegar that we make will also have the mother in it. It won't be fully developed. And my ultimate goal is to develop some of our vinegar to where I have a really good functional mother. It's called mother because you can use it just like you do a sourdough start to start other batches of vinegar and save going through some of the steps that we're going to go through because we're going to be doing this from scratch. So vinegar is a mixture of water and acetic acid. The amount of water that they add to that acetic acid is monitored for commercial vinegars. It has to be a certain percent of acetic acid to use in canning. And so the vinegar that we make at home is not suitable for using it in canning because it has not been standardized, and unless you are checking the pH on it, you could get yourself in trouble. So it is always a good idea for when you are doing canning to use bottled vinegar that has controls, and we know exactly the percentage of acetic acid. As I mentioned outside under the apple tree, I had a massive failure with my first attempt at doing vinegar, and it is because I did not really understand fully the science behind how vinegar is made. Now, part of our channel is all about the scientific background for why we do the things we do in food preservation. And so part of self-reliance is us sharing what the science is behind things. And so I'm going to just give you some very brief information about the science behind vinegar. As I mentioned before, this is acetic acid mixed with water up to a certain percentage of the acetic acid. Now, we can't control that at homemade vinegar, but we can take a look at the pH. And those of you who have watched our channel a lot know that I do a lot with litmus paper in checking the acidity of different foods. So we'll be doing that as we go along. And I have actually ordered a different type of pH that this measures pH from the lowest end to the highest end. The litmus paper that I have just ordered takes a little snippet of that scale and enlarges it so that the scale has increments that are smaller than just 1. So it's not a pH of 4, it might be a pH of 4.5. And so we'll be able to tell just exactly as we progress what the pH of our vinegar is. Now, there are a lot of ways to make vinegar. I have developed this in my mind, and I have not yet tested this, so this is my test run of my new and improved way of doing vinegar. So we will see how this works, and if it works the way I'm pretty confident it is going to work, we are going to have so much fun making vinegars going forward. And vinegar is not an overnight process. It takes weeks and sometimes even months. And so we'll be checking back in from time to time on this vinegar. And so it will be a while for us to get going on this, but I'm in it for the long haul. And I hope you'll stick with me if you are interested in doing vinegar. Nothing could be simpler, actually. It's a very easy process. When you start with the raw fruit, the way we're going to start, making vinegar is a 2-step process. If you start with alcohol base, then it's only a 1-step process. But we're going to start from the raw fruit end. And you can pretty much use any fruit. You can use scraps. I am using full apples right here that have been picked up off the ground under our tree. This tree, as far as we know, my best guess is that they are Fuji apples, but they are sweet. They're my favorite eating apple of the several apple trees that we have on our property. When we do that, then we have to go through the first step, which is an anaerobic process, meaning not in the presence of oxygen, no oxygen allowed, for the yeast to act on the sugars that are here, and we're going to add a little bit more sugar to the mix, and ferment to alcohol. We want an alcoholic liquid to be formed from this first step. And again, it is anaerobic. It is accomplished without oxygen, not in the presence of oxygen. Then the bacteria take over, and these bacteria you're probably familiar with. Lactobacillus, you've heard of that one. It is a very helpful bacteria, as is Acetobacter, which is the other one, other family of bacteria, are going to start acting on the alcohol, and they consume that and turn it into acetic acid. And so the acetic acid is where we want to get to ultimately. Now, the way that we are going to do that is I'm going to just chop these apples, watching for worms and eliminating them when necessary. And these have been rinsed outside. And actually, I'm going to wash these because we did spray for worms early in the season. It apparently didn't do much good. And then we will come back and I'll show you exactly what I'm going to do. Here are the apples. They have now been washed and are clean from any pesticide. And notice that they have wormholes. They have places that are spoiled. And you don't have to use apples like this for vinegar. You can use nice, clean, wonderful apples. But you saw the amount of produce that we have out there under that tree. And so this is one way that I can use that and feel much better about that. We are going to have some waste out there, and that will go into the compost pile, but at least I will be able to do this. And I've made applesauce with those apples before, as I've mentioned. Here is a typical apple. It is a little bit bruised. It has wormholes in it. And so I'm going to cut this open, and it is not necessary to get rid of the core. I do get rid of the stem and a little bit of the blossom end right here. But this one has worm damage, and if Jim will come in real close, this fuzzy brown stuff right here is worm indication. So I'm going to, well, there's a little spider. Get away, buddy, from the apples. Okay, so, and there is a worm hole, and there is a bruise. So I'm going to get rid of, I don't want any part of the worm stuff showing, so that is gone. This crumbly stuff, let me get rid of this little spider. So this little crumbly stuff needs to go. So I'm just going to cut across, and I've opened another little place where there's a wormhole, and right here, so I'm going to get rid of that. And a little piece there. And now this is ready for the jar. So I'm just going to chunk it and put it in. Same thing here, wormhole there, bruise there, get rid of that. There's worm there, not a real, no live worm, but leavings of worms in there. So I am going to get rid of that core. And there's still some left right there, so I'm going to get rid of that. And that. Oh yes, because there's a wormhole on the other side. So just this piece there. Now, my trash is just right here, so I can just scoot stuff off the countertop right into the waste basket. So I'll finish this one as well. This has worm stuff on it, and this one is not as crisp as some of them are. It doesn't matter. You can use apples that are a little bit beyond being perfectly ripe. More worm stuff right there. Now, what about seeds? The seeds can stay because we're not going to be consuming any seeds. They're going to be removed from the mix before it turns into vinegar. Here's our next apple. Get rid of the stem. Oh, this one looks perfect, perfect. So I'm just going to cut this one in thirds and in thirds and drop it in. Here is a worm trail. Get rid of that. Everything else looks good, so in it goes. Okay, now this is about 3/4 full. I'm going to do the same thing for the other jar. I got way too many apples, so I could do several jars of vinegar, but I learned my lesson when I jumped in with both feet about 7 years ago, so I'm just going to do 2. One is going to be ready for use in the kitchen. The other I'm going to set aside for 2 or 3 more months to see if I can develop that mother that I want. So I will be back when I have this jar about 3/4 full of these apples. So see you in a few minutes. All right, I equalized the apples. I had a little bit too much in this one, and now they're just a little bit, about 3/4, a little bit less, between 1/2 and 3/4, which is right where we want them. Now, in this pan, what I have is about 6 cups of water, and to that I have added a scant 1/2 cup of sugar. It is white, regular table sugar. And that is exactly what you want to use. You don't want to use anything fancy, no honey, no anything else, just plain old regular granulated sugar, white. And the reason is because that first step in our fermentations is when the yeast that are already present in there are going to be turning the sugar into alcohol, and we want that sugar to be readily available to them and of the right kind. And so that is why we use just regular white sugar. Now, some people add the sugar separately and then add the water. I like the syrup to be already done so that the sugar is readily available. And then we're going to fill each of these jars to just above the apples, leaving plenty of room for the bubbling and fizzing that is going to be happening during the process of fermentation. When we make sauerkraut, and those of you who have watched our sauerkraut video, and by the way, I will put a little info tag right up here in this right-hand corner so that you can see that sauerkraut video. You will notice, and you just click on it, and then it will come up in your feed down below the video. And in that video, we had to keep the cabbage submerged below the liquid. Now here, we also want to be mindful of that, but because we have both aerobic and anaerobic processes going on at the same time, we don't want to thwart the aerobic process, which is bacteria turning the alcohol into acetic acid. Now, even though there are 2 fermentation steps, when we do home vinegar, these can happen simultaneously. When alcohol is produced, then it can be attacked by the bacteria. It's not that the yeast does its thing in isolation, and then at a given hour, that's done, and then we move to step 2. It's messy and it's happening at the same time. But what we want to do is to stir these apples around in this sugar water to be sure, and they're going to float to the top, to be sure that the same ones aren't always on the top. We don't want mold to grow, and by stirring this every day, we can prevent that mold by dunking the apples back underneath and bringing others up from the bottom. So we can do that. And I have 2 little tools that came in one package, so I can reach way deep with this one. These are in our Amazon store. Now, we wanted to keep all the air out when we did sauerkraut. Not so here. So I'm going to cover each one of these with just a coffee filter that I use for many, many things, but not coffee. And I'm just going to put a lid on the top because we want air exchange so that that anaerobic and the aerobic processes can do their thing. So air needs to be inside. We're just going to watch for mold.